The Marshal of France is a military distinction, rather than a military rank, in contemporary France, that is awarded to generals for exceptional achievements. The title has been awarded since 1185, though briefly abolished and briefly dormant during its millennium of existence. It was one of the great officers of the Crown of France during the Ancien Régime and Bourbon Restoration, and one of the great dignitaries of the Empire during the First French Empire. A Marshal of France displays 7 stars. The Marshal also receives a baton, a blue cylinder with stars, formerly fleurs de lis during the monarchy, and eagles during the First French Empire. It has the Latin inscription Terra Belli, Decus Pacis, which means terror in war, ornament in peace. Between the end of the 16th century and the middle of the 19th century, 6 Marshals of France were given the even more exalted rank of Marshal General of France: Biron, Les Diguières, Turenne, Villiers, Saxe, and Soult. History. The title derived from the office of Maréchal Français created by King Philip II Augustus of France for Alberic Clement. The title was abolished by the National Convention in 1793. It was restored during the First French Empire by Napoleon I as Marshal of the Empire, and then the title was given to Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte, Sovereign Prince of Pontecorvo and later King of Sweden. Under the Bourbon Restoration, the title reverted to Marshal of France, and Napoleon III kept that designation. After the fall of Napoleon III and the Second French Empire, the Third Republic did not use the title until the First World War, when it was recreated as a military distinction and not a rank. Philippe Pétain, awarded the distinction of Marshal of France for his generalship in World War I, retained his title even after his trial and imprisonment and after he was stripped of other positions and titles. The last living Marshal of France was Alphonse Juin, promoted in 1952, who died in 1967. The latest Marshal of France was Marie-Pierre Koenig, who was made a Marshal posthumously in 1984. Today, the title of Marshal of France can only be granted to a general officer who fought victoriously in wartime. Direct captions. Philip II, 1180–1223. Alberic Clement, Marshal of France in 1185. Guillaume de Bournel, Marshal of France in 1192. Nivellon d'Aries, Marshal of France in 1202. Henry I Clement, called the Little Marshal, Lord of La Maison of Argentan, Marshal of France in 1204. Jean III Clement, Lord of La Maison of Argentan, Marshal of France in 1214. Guillaume de la Tournelle, Marshal of France in 1220. Louis IX 1226–1270. Ferry Pastet, Lord of Challeranges, Marshal of France in 1240. Jean-Guillaume de Beaumont, Marshal of France in 1250. Gauthier III, Lord of Nemours, Marshal of France in 1257. Henry II Clement, Lord of La Maison d'Argentan, Marshal of France in 1262. Ecoutard de Beaujeu, Marshal of France in 1265. Renaud de Présigny, Marshal of France in 1265. Hugh of Maupeou, Marshal of France in 1266. Raoul Toussaint, Marshal of France in 1270. Lancelot de Saint-Mard, Marshal of France in 1270. Philip III 1270–1285. Ferry de Verneuil, Marshal of France in 1272. Guillaume V du Bec-Crespin, Marshal of France in 1283. Jean II d'Harcourt, Viscount of Châtellerault, Lord of Harcourt, Marshal of France in 1283. Raoul Villeflamenc, Marshal of France in 1285. Philip IV 1285–1314. Jean de Varenne, Marshal of France in 1288. Simon de Melun, Lord of Le Lupin of Marcheville, Marshal of France in 1290. Guy de Clermont de Nesle, Marshal of France in 1292. Falques du Merle, Marshal of France in 1302. Miles Videnoyers, Marshal of France in 1302. Jean de Corbel, Lord of Grez, Marshal of France in 1308. Louis X, 1314–1316. Jean-Yves de Beaumont, Marshal of France in 1315. Philip V, 1316–1322. Mathieu de Trie, Marshal of France in 1318. Jean Desbars, Marshal of France in 1318. Bernard Vida Monroy, Lord of Monroy, Marshal of France in 1322. Charles IV, 1322–1328. Robert Jean Bertrand de Briquebec, Baron of Briquebec, Viscount of Roncheville, Marshal of France in 1325. Valois, Philip VI, 1328–1350. Anseau de Joinville, Marshal of France in 1339. Charles de Montmorency, Lord of Montmorency, Marshal of France in 1344. Robert de Warren, Lord of St. Venant, Marshal of France in 1344. Guy II de Nesle, Lord of Offemont and of Mello, Marshal of France in 1345. Edouard de Beaujeu, Lord of Châteauneuf, Marshal of France in 1347. John II, 1350–1364. Arnold de Ordehem, Lord of Ordehem, Marshal of France in 1351. Rogues de Hangest, Lord of Avesnicourt, Marshal of France in 1352. Jean de Clermont, Lord of Chantilly and of Beaumont, Marshal of France in 1352. Jean-Le Mainga, Marshal of France in 1356. Charles V, 1364–1380. Jean-Yves de Mauquenchi, Lord of Blainville, Marshal of France in 1368. Louis de Sancerre, Count of Sancerre, Marshal of France in 1369. Charles VI, 1380–1422. Jean II Le Mainga, Marshal of France in 1391. Jean II de Rieux, Lord of Rochefort and of Rieux, Marshal of France in 1397. Pierre de Rieux, Lord of Rochefort and of Rieux, Marshal of France in 1417. Claude de Beauvoir, Lord of Chastellux and Viscount of Avalon, Marshal of France in 1418. Jean de Villiers de L'Isle Adam, Marshal of France in 1418. Jacques de Montbron, Lord of Angoumois, Marshal of France in 1418. Gilbert Mottier de Lafayette, Marshal of France in 1421. Antoine de Vergy, Marshal of France in 1422. Jean de La Baume, Count of Montrevel and Bresse, Marshal of France in 1422. Charles VII, 1422–1461. Amaury de Séverac, Lord of Beaucaire and of Chaudeaux, Marshal of France in 1424. Jean de Brosset, Baron of Boussac and of Saint-Sévier, Marshal of France in 1426. Giles de Rais, Lord of Ingrand and of Champtocé, Marshal of France in 1429. André de Lavelle Montmorency, Lord of Loac and of Retz, Marshal of France in 1439. Philippe de Coulant, Lord of Jalloins, of Le Croisset, of Saint-Armand and of Chalais, Marshal of France in 1441. Jean Potin de Zintrailles, Seneschal de Limousin, Marshal of France in 1454. Louis XI, 1461–1483. Joachim Rouault de Gamaix, Lord of Boismenard, Marshal of France in 1461. Jean de Lescun, Count of Comminges, Marshal of France in 1461. Wolfart V van Bosselin, Lord of Vere in Zealand and Earl of Buchan in Scotland, Marshal of France in 1464. Pierre de Rohan de Gie Acute, Lord of Rohan, Marshal of France in 1476. Charles VIII, 1483–1498. Philippe de Crèvecoeur d'Esquerdes, Marshal of France in 1486. Jean de Baudricourt, Lord of Choiseul and Bailiff of Chaumont, Marshal of France in 1486. Valois-Orléans, Louis XII, 1498–1515. Gian Giacomo Trivolzio, Marquis of Vivano, Marshal of France in 1499. Charles II d'Amboise, Lord of Chaumont, of Mélène and of Charenton, Marshal of France in 1506. Odette de Foix, Vicomte de Lautrec, Viscount of Lautrec, Marshal of France in 1511. Robert Stewart, Lord of Aubigny, Count of Lennox, Marshal of France in 1514. Valois-Angoulême, Francis I, 1515–1547. Jacques II de Chabannes, Lord of La Palisse, Marshal of France in 1515. Gaspard I de Coligny, Lord of Châtillon-sur-Loing, Marshal of France in 1516. Thomas de Foy-Lescun, Marshal of France in 1518. Anne de Montmorency, Duke of Montmorency and of Damville, Count of Beaumont-sur-Oise and of Damartin, Viscount of Melun, 1st Baron of France and Grand Master, Constable of France etc. Marshal of France in 1522. Théodore Trivolche, Marshal of France in 1526. Robert III de la Marque, Duke of Bouillon, Lord of Sedan, Marshal of France in 1526. Claude d'Arnabeau, Marshal of France in 1538. René de Montjean, Lord of Montjean, Marshal of France in 1538. Aldard du Bise, Seigneur of La Bise, Marshal of France in 1542. Antoine de Letz d'Esprez, Lord of Montpezat, Marshal of France in 1544. Jean Carriacoli, Prince of Melfis, Marshal of France in 1544. Henry II, 1547–1559. Jacques d'Albon de Saint-André, Marquis of Fronsac, Marshal of France 1547. Robert IV de la Marque, Duke of Bouillon and Prince of Sedan, Marshal of France in 1547. Charles I de Cossé, Count of Brisac, Marshal of France in 1550. Pietro Strozzi, Marshal of France in 1554. Paul de la Barthe, Lord of Thermes, Marshal of France in 1558. Francis II, 1559–1560. François de Montmorency, Duke of Montmorency, Marshal of France in 1559. Charles IX, 1560–1574. François de Scepo, Lord of Vieilleville, Marshal of France in 1562. Imbert de la Platrière, Lord of Bourdion, Marshal of France in 1564. Henry I de Montmorency, Lord of Damville, Duke of Montmorency, Count of Damartin and Alais, Baron of Chateaubriand, Lord of Chantilly and Ecouen, Marshal of France in 1566. Artus de Cossé-Brisac, Lord of Gonner and Count of Secondagne, Marshal of France in 1567. Reinhold von Krokov, commander of the German Huguenot contingent at Jarnac. Gaspard de Saulx, Lord of Tavannes, Marshal of France in 1570. Honorat II de Savoy, Marquis of Villers, Marshal of France in 1571. Albert de Gondi, Duke of Retz, Marshal of France in 1573. Henry III, 1574–1589. Roger I de Saint-Lary, Lord of Bellegarde, Marshal of France in 1574. Blaise de la Sire and Massencombe, Seigneur de Montluc, Marshal of France in 1574. Louis Prévost de Sansac, Baron de Sansac, Marshal of France. Armand de Gontaut, Baron de Biron, Marshal of France in 1577. Jacques de Gouillon, Lord of Matignon and of L'Espard, Count of Thorigny, Prince of Mortagne-sur-Gironde, Marshal of France in 1579. Jean Vida Ormont, Baron of Estrabon, Count of Châteauroux, Marshal of France in 1571. Guillaume de Joyeuse, Viscount of Joyeuse, Lord of Saint Didier of Lourdes, of Bivet and of Arx, Marshal of France in 1582. Charles II de Cossé, Duke of Brisac, Marshal of France. Bourbons. Henry IV 1589–1610, Henry de Lane, Tour d'Auvergne, Vicomte de Turenne, Duc de Bouillon, Marshal of France in 1592. Charles de Gontaut, Duc de Biron, Marshal of France in 1594. Claude de la Châtre, Baron de la Maisonfit, Marshal of France in 1594. Jean de Montluc de Balagny, Marshal of France in 1594. Jean III de Beaumanoir, Marquis of Lavardin and Count of Nègrepelisse, Marshal of France in 1595. Henry, Duke of Joyeuse, Marshal of France in 1595. Urbain de Montmorency Laval, Marquis of Sablé, Marshal of France in 1595. Alphonse d'Ornano, Marshal of France in 1597. Guillaume de Haute-Inmer, Count of Grancy, Marshal of France in 1597. François de Bon, Duke of Les Diguières, Marshal of France in 1608. Louis XIII, 1610–1643, Concino Concini, Marquis of Ancre, Marshal of France in 1613. Giles de Courtenvaux, Marquis of Souvray, Marshal of France in 1614. Antoine, Baron de Roquelaure, Marshal of France in 1614. Louis de la Châtre, Baron de Maisonfit, Marshal of France in 1616. Pons de Lorzières Temines Cardaillac, Marquis of Temines, Marshal of France in 1616. François de Lagrange d'Arquian, Lord of Montagny and of Serry in Berry, Marshal of France in 1616. Nicolas de l'Hôpital, Duke of Vitry, Marshal of France in 1617. Charles de Choiseul Praslin, Marquis of Praslin, Marshal of France in 1619. Jean-François de la Guiche, Count of La Palisse, Marshal of France in 1619. Honoré d'Albert Daly, Duke of Chalons, Marshal of France in 1620. François d'Esparbes de Luçan, Viscount of Aubertier, Marshal of France in 1620. Charles de Créquy, Prince of Poix, Duke of Les Diguières, Marshal of France in 1621. Jacques Nompard de Cormont, Duke of La Force, Marshal of France in 1621. François, Marquis of Bassompierre, Marshal of France in 1622. Gaspard de Coligny, Duke of Châtillon, Marshal of France in 1622. Henry de Schomberg, Marshal of France in 1625. Jean-Baptiste d'Ornano, Marshal of France in 1626. François Annibal, Duc d'Estrées, Marshal of France in 1626. Timoleon de Pinay de Saint-Luc, Marshal of France in 1627. Louis de Marillac, Count of Beaumont-le-Roger, Marshal of France in 1629. Henry II, Duke of Montmorency and of Damville, also Admiral of France, Marshal of France in 1630. Jean-Claude d'Anduze de Saint-Bonnet, Marquis of Toiras, Marshal of France in 1630. Antoine Coiffier de Rozay-Defayet, Marshal of France in 1631. Urbain de Maillet, Marquis of Bar-Écoute, Marshal of France in 1633. Maximilien de Bethune, Duke of Sully, Marshal of France in 1634. Charles de Schomberg, Duke of Héloïne, Marshal of France in 1637. Charles de Laporte, Marquis of Maillé, Marshal of France in 1639. Antoine III, Duke of Gramont, Marshal of France in 1641. Jean-Baptiste Boudes, Count of Guebriant, Marshal of France in 1642. Philippe de la Motte Foudencourt, Duke of Cardona, Marshal of France in 1642. François de l'Hôpital, Count of Rosny, Marshal of France in 1643, Henry de la Tour d'Auvergne, Vicomte de Turenne, Marshal of France in 1643, Marshal General of France in 1660, Jean, Count of Gassion, Marshal of France in 1643. Louis XIV, 1643–1715 CE Acute Sar, Duke of Choiseul, Marshal of France in 1645. Josias, Count of Rancer, Marshal of France in 1645. Nicolas de Neufville, Duke of Villeroy, Marshal of France in 1646. Antoine d'Aumont de Roche Baron, Duc d'Aumont, Marshal of France in 1651. Jacques d'Etampes, Marquis of La Ferté-Imbert, Marshal of France in 1651. Henry, Duke of La Ferté-Sainte, Marshal of France in 1651. Charles de Mouchy, Marquis d'Auquincourt, Marshal of France in 1651. Jacques Ruxel, Count of Grancy, Marshal of France in 1651. Armand Nompard de Cormont, Duke of La Force, Marshal of France in 1652. Philippe de Clérambault, Count of La Pallois, Marshal of France in 1652. Ce Acute Sar Phoebus d'Albret, Count of Meissen, Marshal of France in 1653. Louis de Foucauld Saint-Germain-Beaupré, Count of La Dornion, Marshal of France in 1653. Jean de Sculemberg, Count of Montégut, Marshal of France in 1658. Abraham de Fabert, Marquis of Estenay, Marshal of France in 1658. Jacques de Mauverchier, Marquis of Castelnau, Marshal of France in 1658. Bernardine Gigard, Marquis of Bellefonds, Marshal of France in 1668. François de Créquy, Marquis of Marines, Marshal of France in 1668. Louis de Crevand, Duke of Humieres, Marshal of France in 1668. Godefroy d'Estrades, Count of Estrades, Marshal of France in 1675. Philippe de Montauby Aquitaine, Duke of Navailles, Marshal of France in 1675. Frédéric Armand, Duke of Schomberg, Marshal of France in 1675. Jacques-Henri de Durfort, Duke of Duras, Marshal of France in 1675. François de Aubusson, Duke of La Feuillade, Marshal of France in 1675. Louis Victor de Roche-Chouart, Duke of Mortemartre, Maréchal de Vivonne, Marshal of France in 1675. François-Henri de Montmorency, Duc de Luxembourg, Marshal of France in 1675. Henry Louis de Luigny, Marquis of Rochefort, Marshal of France in 1675. Guy de Durfort, Duke of Lorges, Marshal of France in 1676. Jean II, Count of Estrées 1624–1707, Marshal of France in 1681. Claude de Choiseul, Marquis of Francières, Marshal of France in 1693. Jean-Armand de Joyeuse, Marquis of Grand-Pré, Marshal of France in 1693. François de Neufville, Duke of Villeroy, Marshal of France in 1693. Louis François, Duc de Boufflers, Comte de Cagny, Marshal of France in 1693. And Hilarion de Costantin, Count of Tourville, Marshal of France in 1693. And Jules, 2nd Duc de Noailles, Marshal of France in 1693. Nicolas Catinat, Marshal of France in 1693. Louis Joseph de Bourbon, Duc de Vendôme, Marshal of France in 1695. Claude Louis Hector, Duke of Villars, Marshal of France in 1702. Marshal General of France in 1733. Noel Berton, Marquis of Camilly, Marshal of France in 1703. Victor Marie, Duc d'Estrées, Marshal of France in 1703, François-Louis Rousselet, Marquesses of Château-Renaud, Marshal of France in 1703, Sébastien Le Prestre, Marquis of Bourbon, Marshal of France in 1703, Conrad, Marquis of Rosen, Marshal of France in 1703, Nicolas Chalon du Bellaicut, Marquis of Huxelles, Marshal of France in 1703, René de Froley, Count of Tessé, Marshal of France in 1703, Camille d'Austin, Duc de Tallard, Marshal of France in 1703, Nicolas Auguste de la Baume, Marquis of Montrevel, Marshal of France in 1703, Henry, Duc d'Harcourt, Marshal of France in 1703, Ferdinand, Count of Marsan, Marshal of France in 1703, James Fitzjames, 1st Duke of Berwick, Marshal of France in 1706, Charles-Auguste Guyon, Count of Matignon, Marshal of France in 1708, Jacques de Bazin, Marquis of Bezon, Marshal of France in 1709, Pierre de Montesquieu, Count of Artagnan, Marshal of France in 1709 N.B., not the famous D'Artagnan, but a relative. Alberico III Cibo Malaspina, Duke of Massa, Marshal of France in 1703, Louis XV, 1715–1774 Victor Maurice, Comte de Broglie, Marshal of France in 1724, Antoine Gaston Jean-Baptiste, Duke of Roquelaure, Marshal of France in 1724, Jacques Ruxel, Count of Grancy and of Medevy, Marshal of France in 1724, Éléonore du Maine, Count of Labourg, Marshal of France in 1724, Yves Marquis de Legris, Marshal of France in 1724, Louis de Aubusson, Duke of La Feuillade, Marshal of France in 1724, Antoine V, Duke of Gramont, Marshal of France in 1724, Alain Emmanuel, Marquis of Coët-Logon, Marshal of France in 1730, Charles de Gontaut, Duke of Biron, Marshal of France in 1734, Jacques de Chastenet, Marquis of Puy-Ségur, Marshal of France in 1734, Claude Bidel, Marquis of Asfeld, Marshal of France in 1734, Adrien Maurice, 3rd Duc de Noailles, Marshal of France in 1734, Christian Louis de Montmorency, Luxembourg, Prince de Tingry, Marshal of France in 1734, François-Marie II, Duke of Broglie, Marshal of France in 1734, François de Franquetot, Duke of Coigny, Marshal of France in 1734, Charles, Duke of Bellaicut via Charles, Marshal of France in 1734, Louis de Brancas de Forcalquier, Marquis of Seyrest, Marshal of France in 1740, Louis Auguste d'Albert Daly, Duke of Chalons, Marshal of France in 1741, Louis Armand de Brichanteau, Duke of Nangis, Marshal of France in 1741, Louis de Gand de Mero de Montmorency, Prince d'Enghien, Marshal of France in 1741, Jean-Baptiste de Durfort, Duke of Duras, Marshal of France in 1741, Jean-Baptiste Desmarets, Marquis of Maillebois, Marshal of France in 1741, Charles Fouquet, Duke of Belle-Isle, called the Marshal of Belle-Isle, Marshal of France in 1741, Maurice, Comte de Saxe, Marshal of France in 1741, Marshal General of France in 1747, Jean-Baptiste Andro, Marquis of Maulevrier, Marshal of France in 1745, Claude Testuz, Marquis of Balincourt, Marshal of France in 1746, Philippe Charles, Marquis of La Fère, Marshal of France in 1746, François, Duc d'Harcourt, Marshal of France in 1746, Guy, Count of Montmorency-Laval, Marshal of France in 1747, Gaspard, Duke of Clermont-Tonnerre 1688–1781, Marshal of France in 1747. Louis Claude, Marquis of La Motte-Houdancourt, Marshal of France in 1747. Ulrich, Count of Lowendahl, Marshal of France in 1747. Louis-François Armand Duplessis, Duc de Richelieu, Marshal of France in 1748. Jean de Fay, Marquis of La Tour-Maubourg, Marshal of France in 1757. Louis-Antoine de Gontaut, Count of Biron, Marshal of France in 1757. Daniel François de Gex de Voisins d'Ambers, Viscount of Lautrec, Marshal of France in 1757. Charles-François Frédéric de Montmorency, Duke of Bigny-Luxembourg, Marshal of France in 1757. Louis Letellier, Duc d'Estrées, Marshal of France in 1757. Jean-Charles de La Ferté, Marquis of La Ferté-Santerre, Marshal of France in 1757. Charles O'Brien de Thomond, Count of Thomond and of Clare, Marshal of France in 1757. Gaston de Hélier-Cutevies, Duke of Mirepoix, Marshal of France in 1757. Ladislas Ignace de Bercheny, Marshal of France in 1758. Hubert de Brienne, Count of Conflans, Marshal of France in 1758. Louis-Georges, Marquis of Contains, Marshal of France in 1758. Charles de Rohan, Prince of Soubise, Marshal of France in 1758. Victor François, Duc de Broglie, Marshal of France in 1759. Guy Michel de Durfort de Lorge, Duke of Randon, Marshal of France in 1768. Louis de Brienne de Conflans, Marquis of Armentières, Marshal of France in 1768. Jean de Cossé, Duke of Brisac, Marshal of France in 1768. Louis XVI (1774–1792) and Pierre, Duke of Harcourt, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Louis IV, Duc de Noailles, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Antoine, Count of Nicolai, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Charles, Duke of Fitzjames, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Philippe, Duke of Mouchy, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Emmanuel de Durfort, Duke of Duras, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Louis-Nicolas, Duc d'Umouy, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Claude, Count of Saint-Germain, Marshal of France since 24 March 1775. Guy de Montmorency, Duke of Laval, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Augustin, Count of Mailly, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Henry Bouchard de Luçan, Marquis of Auberterre, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Charles de Beauvau, Prince of Beauvau-Cron, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Noel Jourda, Count of Vaux, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Philippe Henry, Marquis de Ségur, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Jacques de Coissil-Stainville, Count of Coissil, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Charles de Lacroix, Marquis of Castres, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Emmanuel de Croix-Solrey, Duke of Croix, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. François Gaston de Hélier-Cutevies, Duc de Hélier-Cutevies, Marshal of France since 13 June 1783. Nicolas Luckner, Comte Luckner, Marshal of France since 28 December 1791. Jean-Baptiste Donation de Vimy, Comte de Rochambeau, Marshal of France since 28 December 1791. First Empire. Napoleon created 26 marshals of the empire: Louis-Alexandre Berthier, Prince of Neufchâtel and of Wagram, Duke of Valangin, Marshal of the empire in 1804. Wiki Murat, Prince d'Empire, Grand Duke of Berg, King of Naples, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Bon Adrien Ginot de Moncy, Duke of Conegliano, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, Count Jourdan, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. André Masséna, Duke of Rivoli, Prince of Essling, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Pierre-François Charles Augereau, Duke of Castiglione, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte, Prince of Pontecorvo, King of Sweden and Norway under the name Charles XIV John, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Guillaume Marie and Brune, Count Brune, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Jean de Dussault, Duke of Dalmatia, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Marshal General of France in 1847. Jean Lannes, Duke of Montebello, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Edouard Adolphe Casimir Joseph Mortier, Duke of Trévise, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Michel Ney, Duke of Elchingen, Prince of La Moscow, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Louis Nicolas Davout, Duke of Ostade, Prince of Egmont, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Jean-Baptiste Bessières, Duke of Istria, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. François-Christophe de Kellermann, Duke of Valmy, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. François-Joseph Lefebvre, Duke of Danzig, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Dominique Catherine de Perignon, Marquess of Grenade, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Jean-Mathieu Philibert Serruria, Count Serruria, Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Claude Victor, Duke of Boulogne, Marshal of the Empire in 1807. Jacques MacDonald, Duke of Taranto, Marshal of the Empire in 1809. Nicolas Charles Oudinot, Duke of Reggio, Marshal of the Empire in 1809. Auguste Frédéric Louis Visa de Marmont, Duke of Ragusa, Marshal of the Empire in 1809. Louis Gabriel Suchet, Duke of Albufeira, Marshal of the Empire in 1811. Laurent de Wouviens-Saint-Cyr, Marquess of Wouviens-Saint-Cyr, Marshal of the Empire in 1812. Joseph Anthony Poniatowski, Prince Poniatowski, Marshal of the Empire in 1813. Emmanuel de Grouchy, Marquis de Grouchy, Marshal of the Empire in 1815. The names of many of these have been given to successive stretches of an avenue encircling Paris, which has thus been nicknamed the Boulevards des Maréchaux.